The Fall of the House of Usher, page 317, September 1839. People like that quack Bonaparte often interpret Poe's large production of Gothic horror as an indication of his need to exorcise his own spiritual demons. But if you look at the magazines and the stories that were being published at the same time as these stories, you see that there was an obvious audience for Gothic horror. People liked these stories and still do, which is why they are the most popular of Poe's tales. This was mainstream popular literature in the 1840s, much as Stephen King is today. In fact, that is probably why Poe included the Gothic story, The Mad Tryst of Sir Lancelot Canning, at the end of the story. It is a parody of old, overworked Gothic stories. The inclusion of the story would seem to deflate the suspense, and with it, the serious interest we might have in Usher. But instead, the tryst gives us the story intensity. It is as if Poe is saying to his reader, these crazy Gothic stories may be uncouth and unimaginative, as the narrator refers to the Mad Tryst on page 332, but they have an uncanny power over readers. The Fall of the House of Usher is another one of Poe's ultra-famous stories, even though, as his stories go, it is one of the more difficult stories to read. So let's look at some of the often asked questions about the story, some of which we will attempt to discuss here. 1. What is the significance of the close resemblance of Roderick Usher and his sister, and are the two the product of and guilty of incest? 2. Did Roderick intentionally try to murder Madeline, and did Madeline actually return from her tomb, vampire-like, to claim her brother's life? 3. Is the physical house actually alive, and by some preternatural, which means out of or being beyond the normal course of nature, so is some preternatural force of will controlling the destinies of Usher? Or is the story not a tale of the supernatural at all, but rather a work of psychological realism? What then is the role of the narrator? 5. If the tale is symbolic, then what is the meaning of the interpolated story of the Mad Tryst? What is the meaning of Usher's artwork? Just like Ligeia, a comparison with Usher would be an excellent paper topic. It is misleading to conceive of the meaning of the story as devolving solely upon any single and fixed subject. Nevertheless, there is, as with Ligeia, a basic structure that integrates all the others, a set or system of relationships that remains constant and primary. In other words, the story has the double aspect of the supernatural, but it is also realistic in a conventional sense. Our experience of the mixing of the supernatural and the real results from our perception of the subjectivity of the narrator, whom we recognize as disturbed and subjectively involved in, but at the same time detached from, the details of the story. Like many of his best tales, Poe created an ironic mockery of the ability of the human mind ever to know anything with certainty. So let's look at the fall of the House of Usher in the same manner that we have looked at other works. 1. Plot. The narrator appears upon a summons to his former friend Roderick Usher's house, where he finds his friend in the state of nervous collapse and a previously unknown twin sister deathly ill. In an attempt to distract Usher from his worries, the narrator spends time reading and discussing, but to no avail. The sister dies, and Usher and the narrator bury her in the family catacombs. But it turns out that the sister is merely a victim of catatonic epilepsy. Usher has knowingly buried his sister alive. His hearing is so acute that he can hear her scratching at the coffin. By some extra human strength, the sister frees herself and appears in Usher's study, where she dies falling into his arms as he dies of terror. Symbolically, the house crumbles as the narrator flees. Characterization. Usher's character is fully developed as a nervous man, morbid, fearing death, perhaps mad. The narrator, however, is also developed. At first, he's a caring friend, but eventually Usher's nervousness has its effect on the narrator, who in the end could also be considered mad. How does the quotation at the beginning of the story help characterize Roderick Usher? Quote.
Son cœur est un luth suspendu. Sitôt qu'on le touche, il résonne. De Béranger, page 317. His heart is a suspended lute. The moment one touches it, it responds.
The quotation warns of a potential dissolution of the borders between illusion and reality. We learn at once that the heart of the artist, Roderick Usher, is like a lute that resonates to all that touches it. In what ways do Madeline and Roderick resemble each other? How do the character's actions during his stay at the mansion help characterize him? These are good points to bring up in this week's discussion forum. Point of view. The story uses first-person narration. The story is told entirely through the eyes of the narrator, which, if he is mad, calls into question the reliability of the narration. What is the role of the narrator in this story? He arrives at the house to help a boyhood friend, views the events he witnesses during his stay with skepticism, and then, by the end of the tale, undergoes a soul-shaking transformation. What specific events account for his change in attitude? Poe employs the same narrative device that he uses in the Dupin stories by introducing a secondary narrator who basically tells the protagonist's story. He separates the central protagonist, Roderick Usher, who is the embodiment of obsession and his desire from his observing self. The story begins with the entrance of the narrator into the world of Usher. The opening of the story, one of the most famous in all of literature, simulates the process by which the reader enters into the patterned reality of art. Obviously affected, but puzzled as to what could have created such an effect. The approach, as is the approach of the narrator, is an objective, rational one, But just as the narrator gets sucked into the lives of the ushers, the reader gets sucked into the story to the point that the narrator and the reader begin to accept the fantasy as real. Setting. The setting is gray, gloomy, luminous, gas, eeriness. The setting is purposely used to increase the terror and the suspense. It has supernatural qualities. Look at the first sentence. Dull, dark, soundless, autumn, oppressively, dreary, shades, melancholy. On page 319, Poe depicts the Usher siblings as the final two in a family that belongs to a fallen world. Their home and grounds are described as being pervaded by an atmosphere which has no affinity with the air of heaven. Poe has created an atmosphere that matches the shame, frustration, and sickness of a family tree that's seeking to maintain its strong, pure, and aristocratic bloodlines, has dwindled into the final remaining members of the family who are analogous to the decayed trees that surround the property. Theme. Showing the connection between the organic and the inorganic world is one of Poe's favorite themes. The house of Usher becomes a metaphor for the human mind. Beneath the surface of decay and horror is a psychological dimension that reveals not only the decay of a once noble family, but also the increased psychological uneasiness of the narrator. Questions to ponder for this week's discussion forum. How does the narrator's description of his approach to the mansion foreshadow the conflicts in the story? How does the narrator's reading of the story of Ethelred bring the story to its climax?